first off, I just want to say where this title for this presentation comes from, not for the purpose of punishment. So we often think of the juvenile legal system as a total analog to the adult criminal legal system. We think this is what happens when a child gets arrested, they go to court and they get prosecuted, right? But the reality is that in many states, though not all, there are provisions in the law that say that children's custody is not for the purpose of punishment. I practice in one such state, Louisiana, where the law specifically says custody for children is not about punishment. So what is it about? Then it's about rehabilitation. So if this system is rehabilitative, and I'm not going to argue with anyone that I necessarily agree that it usually is or always is, but that's what the law says. If we agree with that, if we take that at its word, then how should we be treating children who are in custody? And in a lot of ways, as you all have seen through your research this summer, COVID-19 has really brought to the surface a lot of the injustices, the disparities, the challenges in the criminal legal system. And children's courts, children's facilities where they're held, jails and prisons for children, are no exception to that. So, whoops, there we go. Okay, so how many youth are locked up in the US and where are they? This chart from the Prison Policy Initiative shows where kids are in the US. So detention centers is the name we give to juvenile jails, meaning that kids in detention centers generally are being held pre-trial. There are kids who are held there on technical violations or things like that, but generally they are pre-adjudication, adjudication being the word we give to a trial in the juvenile legal system. That is different than long-term secure care facilities. And long-term secure care facilities, I'm sorry, I'm pointing at my screen over here, are most like adult prisons. Most of them have rooms that look a lot like adult prisons. And if you were to go visit one, you might say, huh, this is just a prison. And it is, but we tend to call them something else because we hold children in them. Then there are places like residential treatment programs and group homes. Those are more likely to have either dorm or communal settings. Group homes typically are much smaller than what we would think of as sort of a prison type facility. For anyone who heard about the announcement in Illinois about their move to get rid of their juvenile prisons, what they mean by that is they're moving from having long-term secure care facilities where hundreds of kids are held to residential treatment or group home type facilities where no more than 50 children will be held in one place. And then of course, some children are tried and held in the adult system because of juvenile transfer laws in the United States. And so about 4,500 kids any given day are in adult prisons and jails. The kids that I'm going to focus on today are the kids who are in detention centers and long-term secure facilities. That's mostly because there's information about what's happening to them during the pandemic, which is not necessarily true of the others. And because the adult system is really a separate issue, because once kids are in the adult system, they don't get treated like kids anymore, regardless of their biological age and developmental status. So which kids are these kids? The juvenile legal system, like the adult legal system, is disproportionately incarcerates, prosecutes, affects Black children and American Indian or Native children at very disproportionate rates. So 42% of boys and 35% of girls in juvenile facilities in the United States are Black, even though only 14% of youth in the US are Black. And American Indian children 3% of girls and 1.5% of boys in juvenile facilities, despite the fact that they are less than 1% of all youth nationally. And that excludes kids who are in Indian country facilities. So this is only kids who are in non-tribal court facilities. And this also really varies by state. So if you look at the numbers in Louisiana, where I practice, 80%, I think it's actually 81% of children in juvenile prison are Black children, even though the state has about 40% Black children. And for purposes of our discussion today, it's really, really important to understand that 70 to 90% of children who come into the juvenile legal system have already experienced some form of trauma in their lives. So what has the juvenile legal system looked like during COVID? So a lot of the same changes that have happened in the adult system have happened in the juvenile system. Interestingly, between March 1st and June 1st, we saw a 27% overall decrease in youth detention, in the youth detention population, excuse me, since the beginning of the pandemic. And that's mostly, and when I talk about youth detention, remember I'm talking about those jails, right? Not post-adjudication facilities. And that was trending downward until May. And then from May to June, we actually saw a 6% increase back up. So even after that 6% increase, we're at a 27% total decrease. Interestingly, admissions among Black youth declined slightly more than admissions of white youth, but releases of Black youth have slowed relative to white youth. So when you talk about that decrease in admissions by race, we saw a pretty proportionate fall in admissions, but youth of color were already very overrepresented in the system. So in absolute terms, 78% of the decline in admissions was among youth of color. But now that we have this release change, before COVID, the white release rate was about 7% higher than the Black release rate. And now by May, it is 17% higher. So that's almost doubling that gap. Anecdotally, here in Baton Rouge, we saw arrests really fall at the beginning of the pandemic. And just because less arrests were being made overall, people were staying home. Law enforcement wasn't being deployed in the same ways that it typically is. And so we saw arrests fall. That seems to have kind of dissipated at this point. We're seeing people come in at about the same rate. Adjudication in most cases, again, reminding you that that means trial in the juvenile system, has really stalled. Trials are being continued indefinitely because they're really difficult to have over Zoom, unlike other types of hearings that maybe you might have over Zoom. And a lot of courts really aren't open yet. To the extent that courts are beginning to open, there's still a really huge backlog in cases. What does that mean for kids? Well, kids who are held in pretrial detention are oftentimes waiting. Many of the state Supreme Court orders have waived speedy trial rights, which is a big deal which is a bigger deal in some jurisdictions than others, depending on what statutory speedy trial rights look like. So in Louisiana, by way of example, and I'm going to turn to it a lot, I'm sorry if you're not a Louisiana practitioner, but the time delays are 90 days. So case has to go from that first arraignment hearing all the way to trial in 90 days for a child in Louisiana. Because of this, trials are going way beyond 90 days. But the Supreme Court has said that's fine because of the pandemic. In terms of effectiveness of the youth justice system, it really calls that into question a little bit. We know from just how children's minds work that the most effective time for punishment is close in time. That's the reason the time delays are very, very different between adult court, where you might really not have a trial for years, versus juvenile court, where you're likely to have a trial in a few months. And as you push the trial time horizon out further, it becomes less and less linked, the punishment becomes less and less linked to behavior. So there's some real questions about how this is going to work sort of on the back end of this when a lot of those trials actually get heard. And of course, ability to investigate and witnesses and all those things can disappear in the meantime. And then in terms of disposition, I think anecdotally, we've been able to keep some kids out of custody who maybe in normal times might have been sent into custody because of concerns around COVID. But a lot of dispositions were also initially put on hold, and so those are kind of beginning to happen. It also becomes really complicated when you have, or maybe complicated might be the wrong word, but it becomes a little strange when you have a disposition hearing on Zoom and then a child gets ordered into custody and the police or sheriffs show up at their front door knocking to take the kid into custody. And I know that's happened in our jurisdiction at least once, and I'm sure it's happened elsewhere as well. And we know that mediated communication is not very effective for kids. Mediated communication meaning like what we're doing now. It's much more effective for kids to understand messages and interact and feel agency and participation in a setting that is not online. I know that many of us have Zoom fatigue or get distracted in the middle of this. Perhaps your mind is wandering off right now. So for important hearings like this, disposition hearings, trials for hearings for kids on Zoom, I just don't see them participating as frequently. And we also have concerns as defenders about how fair the outcomes they get on those media are. There are some studies that show that in parole hearings or asylum hearings via video conference, judges tend to be less, or they have worse outcomes for the people whose rights are being adjudicated. And so we certainly have those concerns in juvenile court as well. What have youth jails and prisons looked like during this time? Well, there are a lot of the same responses that there have had for adult prisons, except there have been far fewer releases. And that's mostly because courts say that children are low risk. They're not likely to die of COVID-19. And so courts have found in general that lesser risk of mortality means that they are pretty much safe where they are. So family and attorney visitation has been suspended. A lot of juvenile facilities have furlough programs, so kids get to go home and stay with their families for specific periods of time during their time in juvenile detention. Those have been suspended. A lot of programs like mental health programming, education, other sorts of recreational activities, they've been suspended completely, or they've been turned into video conference or other mediated communication platforms. There have also been a lot of cases of what the facilities are typically calling medical isolation, but sometimes looks exactly like solitary confinement. So in Louisiana, for example, and I know this happened in Ohio as well, the facilities are using the same, what they call behavioral intervention rooms, which are the same as solitary confinement rooms that they usually use for punitive purposes. They're using those for medical isolation if a kid is waiting to test positive. In Louisiana, they are ignoring the 8-hour maximum limit on time in isolation that has typically been in place. They are allowing kids writing and reading materials in those solitary confinement settings, which they normally wouldn't be allowed. But the court has said that because they're non-punitive, it's not a problem, even though the psychological distress caused by solitary confinement isn't necessarily linked to its punitiveness. It's more related to the conditions. A lot of facilities have seen a lack of testing or slow testing, though that is kind of improving as time goes on. There have been COVID-19 outbreaks among staff and children, and I'm going to show you some recent numbers from that. There are staff shortages as staff members get sick. It's not that easy to replace them for obvious reasons. And there have been limits on defense teams contacting the children they serve. They certainly can't go in person. And sometimes facilities have really said you can only contact through the lead attorney, whoever that is, even though defense teams often work with multiple attorneys, social workers, and other professionals. So this is sort of the total number of youth cases in juvenile facilities week by week, gathered by Josh Rovner of this sentencing project. If you're on Twitter, at Josh Rovner, he is constantly updating and posting more about these numbers, and it's really interesting to see. The total, we're up to about 13,000 youth cases in juvenile facilities, and that was as of July 24th, and as of July 24th, we were at about 1,500 staff cases in juvenile facilities. Given the state of things in congregate care settings, meaning anywhere where people live close together, so you may remember at the start of the pandemic, it was nursing homes had big outbreaks, prisons are still a hot spot, and so unsurprisingly, juvenile facilities are not left out of that. So advocates have brought challenges to children's detention during the pandemic, and they've mainly sort of fallen into three buckets of types of challenges. So there are motions to modify disposition, and disposition is the juvenile system term for a sentence. Most juvenile courts, if not all, leave some power with the court after someone gets their initial disposition, and they oversee the child throughout the period of their disposition. So you can bring a motion to modify that disposition, and advocates have done that in order to try to get kids out of custody in some cases. Advocates have also brought writs of habeas corpus. They've brought them both as individual habeas corpus actions and as mass habeas corpus filings. And then they've also brought civil suits against different state entities. And I'm going to talk about just two locations where these have happened. I'm going to talk about Louisiana because I'm most familiar with it, and I'm going to talk a little bit about California because it's not just the South where there have been problems administering the legal system during the pandemic. So full disclosure, I was involved in a lot of this litigation and helped strategize about it. So I am far from a neutral observer. But because of that, I also know a lot about what the challenges were. So one of the challenges in Louisiana, at least in New Orleans, was that the juvenile courts decided to close completely at the beginning of the pandemic. They were not accepting filings. They were not holding probable cause hearings. So normally you're entitled to a hearing within 48 hours of arrest to see if there's probable cause so that you can actually stay in detention, and it's a constitutional requirement. The courts weren't holding those hearings at all. So kids were sitting in detention for several days without that determination. So advocates started filing individual writs of habeas corpus and motions to modify disposition. Many of those were being denied without hearing. And on appeal of one of them, the Supreme Court did order the lower courts to begin holding certain types of hearings, such as probable cause hearings, and saying that they couldn't just close completely, even under the state's emergency order. Then there was a federal civil suit brought by Promise of Justice Initiative, Juvenile Law Center, and a law firm alleging violations of the 8th and 14th Amendments, so due process and cruel and unusual punishment. And the cruel and unusual punishment standard for kids is a little different because, as you may remember, there is not a, in Louisiana at least, the custody cannot be for purposes of punishment. So if the sentence has veered into punishment, then it is unconstitutional. At the time of the evidentiary hearing on the temporary restraining order for that case, which we call a TRO, there were 28 out of 30 children who had been tested, or 30 children had been tested, 28 of them had tested positive. So that's a very high positive rate, right? And all of those kids had had fevers, and that's why they were tested in the first place. Thereafter, they stopped testing altogether. They haven't tested any more kids since then. And they say that was the Office of Juvenile Justice says that that was because no kids have shown any symptoms since then. And that was the end of April. The court that heard this discredited the testimony of the 2 children who testified about the conditions. The judge focused on the death rates for children, saying that any potential spike in COVID cases in these facilities was purely speculative. He also said that prolonged use of solitary confinement was reasonable under the circumstances and not likely to lead to harm because it was non-punitive. And he also credited steps that were about to be taken that were taken in response to litigation. So for example, at one point, the facility had given the children masks for a time and then taken them away. In response to the litigation, they gave them masks again. And the court said that that showed that they were taking all possible precautions. So the TRO was denied, if that wasn't clear from the factual findings. In California, the judges were saying that the spread in facilities, there were cases, so I'm going to focus on Los Angeles. There were cases in Los Angeles, a teenager who had spent 3 months in on a technical violation of drug probation. So a technical violation, in case you're not familiar, being something where someone is on probation and they don't get arrested on a new case, but maybe they fail a drug screen, or maybe they are not adhering to curfew, or they're not going to school enough, or something like that. That is not about activity that would be illegal if you were not on probation. So a teenager who was in on three months on a technical violation was denied parole without hearing, just having a pre-existing condition of severe asthma that required nebulizer treatments. There was another child who was also asthmatic, who is 17 years old, and he had less than 5 weeks left in custody for a non-violent property crime. And his probation officer actually was in support of the petition to release him, and the judge also denied his release without a hearing. So the problems that were happening in LA, again, the judges were saying that spread in the facilities was speculative. They were denying a lot of these petitions without a hearing, even for kids who are considered quote unquote low risk. And fewer than half of the judges of the 18 juvenile judges were currently hearing cases at all. Nevertheless, when there was a mass action filed, it was kicked back and forth between the Supreme Court and then the lower court. And finally, the lower court judge said that requests to release juveniles from detention must be based on individualized and a fact-based showing of whether release would be appropriate based on the totality of the circumstances. He said that those factors that they should consider were a detainee's risk of exposure to COVID-19 while in custody, whether the minor had a pre-existing medical condition that made him or her particularly vulnerable, whether the minor would pose a safety risk if they were released, the seriousness of the offense and their history of criminal activity, the minor's release plan or family circumstances. And that order came shortly after the probation department reported that a fourth child had tested positive for COVID-19 in the facility. And of course, the problem with these individualized determinations happening isn't so much that an individualized determination is so impossible, but that a lot of the courts were denying petitions for children who meet these criteria without hearings. And so that's not really a serious way of dealing with the issue. There's also any number of affidavits from public health experts, even prison health experts, who have said that the only way to really stem the spread of this thing inside congregate facilities like jails and prisons is to release more people. And so if there's not a concerted effort to hear these cases and release them, then there are more serious risks inside the facilities. So that all sounds like a whole bunch of stuff about the physical health of these kids. And you're right, it is. So why did I title this talk about trauma, and why even talk about trauma when there are all these other things going on? So for one thing, though we may not be thinking about it this way necessarily, the COVID-19 pandemic has lots of parallels to other disasters. So in disaster scenarios, you have material loss, you have injury or death, and disasters also cause systemic loss of protective factors, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So the systemic loss being things like normal school operation, other normal community supports that exist. Also, like in other disasters, this disaster has had a disproportionate impact on those least able to cope with these circumstances. So Black, Indigenous, people of color have had higher COVID-19 rates and death rates, and low-income folks have also disproportionately lost their jobs. Those are the same populations whose children are most likely to be in these facilities, and the kids in the facilities are worried about their families outside. So kids in custody already have a removal of a lot of the sort of supports that you would have if you were at home with your family. And in a pandemic situation, those kids are even more vulnerable than they otherwise would be. Another reason I'm talking about this is because courts and other decision makers are seeing the virus as more or less a non-threat to these kids. Over and over, I've seen quotations from judges all over the country saying that kids are not at high risk, they're unlikely to contract the illness. If they do contract the virus, they are likely to recover, and that unless there is more proof that more of them will die, that it is not important to get them out of these facilities. It's also important because trauma has long-term effects, and if we recognize this as a traumatic situation from the outset, we can think about how to best support the children who are in this scenario. If we think that they are all just fine and we don't consider that, then we don't have the opportunity to intervene in ways that will protect their mental and physical health in the long term. Finally, kids in the juvenile legal system are often already at high risk to developing trauma symptoms and may already come into the system with trauma symptoms. So we need to consider how this will affect children who are at higher risk to begin with. I'm not going to read this whole thing. This is the DSM definition. Trauma is an event that causes physical, emotional, and psychological harm. And it's not just big, huge, dramatic things that we think about. It can also be things like poverty, housing and food insecurity, exposure to family mental illness, things like that. And of course, you know, periodic depression may set in if a family member is experiencing long-term job loss and financial stress. And that's just one of many ways that the pandemic can be thought of as a traumatic event. A lot of these other issues go right along with that. Traumatic response, the DSM-5 is a psychological manual that discuss a psychiatry manual that helps you diagnose certain things. Lawyers often have them in their office because we deal with the intersection of mental health on a regular basis. So trauma responses include things like avoidance of things related to or that remind a person of the event, negative changes in thoughts and feelings, changes in arousal or reaction to things related to or that remind a person of the traumatic event. So that means like that fight or flight gets activated when you're thinking about that event. And then reoccurring intrusions related to the event. This also intersects with juridogenic harm, which are harms that are caused by the legal process itself. And the kids that come into the juvenile legal system often experience these harms in serious ways. Their injuries might be photographed in public or without their consent. They may be searched or even strip searched. They may be subjected to abusive language by the police during arrest or interrogation. Confinement is inherently a traumatic experience. Many of the kids that I represent are subjected to force during arrest. They're forced to relive events in court, either through video of the event or just through testimony. And too often, players in the juvenile legal system are disrespectful to children or their families during the court process. So how can we think about what the kids who are in custody during this pandemic might be going through? I sort of already referred to their biopsychosocial histories, which is just a really fancy psychiatry, psychology, lawyer term for life history. So things like having mental health, mental disabilities or intellectual disabilities or mental illnesses, those are overrepresented in children in the juvenile legal system. The kids in the juvenile legal system are also more likely to be housing or food insecure or to have lived in poverty than kids in the general population. They're also more likely to have been a witness to or the subject of violence in their home or community. And as a result, they already have risk factors. And it's important to understand that kids can be really resilient to that type of harm, but it's all about the balance of risk factors and protective factors. And risk and protective factors sort of come in three buckets. There are the kids' own attributes, then there's their family's attributes, and then there's things in their environment. And so when their environment is custody, then a lot of those sort of protective factors in the environment get taken away, or at least are much less controllable by the children themselves. We already discussed juridogenic harm, so I'm going to move on from that. The conditions of confinement. As we discussed earlier, the conditions in these facilities have changed pretty drastically during COVID, and children have felt really afraid of some of those changes. One way that we saw that fear of the virus manifesting in April in Louisiana was that children were trying to escape from the facilities. Children who did not have histories of poor behavior in the facilities, kids who were well-adjusted and generally doing really well there, became really afraid and tried to get out. It resulted in a big sort of melee at one point, and because staff in the facility were replacement staff who were not as well trained and who had brought pepper spray into the facility, even though it's not allowed, a bunch of children got pepper sprayed, and then children got sent from that facility to a bunch of other facilities. And so while the Office of Juvenile Justice has insisted that the children are doing fine, and that they are not overly worried about the virus, some of their behavior reflects otherwise. Their educations have been disrupted as a result of the pandemic. And while it's understandable that courses have gone online, sometimes children are receiving packets or are not being provided sort of appropriate level education. The children who brought suit against OJJ said that the packets they were being given took less than an hour to complete and that they weren't receiving any feedback on them. And so children who are in these facilities are likely already to be behind in school. And they're, the pandemic is not helping that situation, certainly. Mental health care services have also been reduced. And because they cannot go on furlough or have families visit, their community ties are also being reduced. And we know that one of the strongest predictors of success after children go home is the strength of their community ties. So that's really concerning from a long-term perspective in terms of the likelihood of children getting rearrested or coming back into contact with the criminal legal system in the future. And of course, as I mentioned, the kids who are in the facilities are far more likely to have their families suffering disproportionately from the effects of COVID. Among lower income people, 52% of low income households say they've had a family member lose a job or take a pay cut. That's even higher among Hispanic folks, who report that 61% have reported job loss or a pay cut. And so we are not really showing adequate concern to the trauma for these kids and cutting them off from their communities in a time when their communities are really suffering. What's really important to understand, though, is that it doesn't have to mean that these kids are all doomed. What we do know is that trauma actually can cause structural changes to the brain, but those changes don't have to be permanent. The term neuroplasticity basically means that the brain, especially for young people, is very moldable. And so having effective mental health treatment really can affect, reduce the number of sort of structural brain changes related to trauma and reduce the traumatic reactions in young people. And adolescence, which is, that period from about 12 or 13 to 18 or so, kind of different definitions, is a key time to develop resilience. So we can take lessons from disasters. Folks who study these things have looked at incidents like Katrina, the Deepwater Horizon disaster, and SARS to provide insights for what we should do now to help the kids who are being exposed to this form of trauma. So there's a few things that are sort of myths that go around about kids in disasters. One is the resilience myth, meaning that people think that kids kind of don't really know what's going on, and therefore they're just going to bounce back no matter what. While it's true that kids have a remarkable ability to bounce back, they also need the right supports to do that. And so in the juvenile legal system, we need to be thinking about what are the supports that kids in custody need right now in order to help them move forward from this time of isolation and stress. There's also the helpless victims myth for children in disaster. That is that things just happen to kids, right? But in fact, kids are resilient and they can help make the situation better. They have agency and they can make a difference, both for themselves and for their communities. And then there's the disasters as equal opportunity events myth. You may even have heard this in reference to COVID-19, that we're all in this together. And while we are all affected, the degree to which we're affected and the ways in which we're affected are incredibly different depending on life circumstances. And kids who have fewer protective factors, whose families have fewer resources, are much more likely to suffer from the traumatic effects of the pandemic and from these other disasters because of their ability to sort of cope with the challenges that come with it. Protective factors, as I sort of mentioned already, are really key to ensuring resilience after a disaster. And one of the most important ones that people have pointed out for children is schools, which is a particular challenge in custody and in a pandemic where schooling is really being yanked out from under children. So we have to think about what other community supports can be put in place, what other supports can be put in place in the facilities themselves to try to substitute for that normalcy that comes through education. We also know that caregivers tend to underestimate children's psychological needs after a disaster. And here I think is one place where we can take lessons about what juvenile justice providers, what juvenile justice departments in different states are doing. They may well believe, and I think they do, that the children are doing okay. But what we don't see is kids' inner lives, right? And especially kids who are teenagers, who are in a place where they may feel they need to appear tough, are probably unlikely to be totally candid about their needs. Children in disasters often say what they think the adults want to hear, or they even try to protect adults from the challenges that they're experiencing because they know the adults around them are experiencing challenges too. And so we need to keep that in mind as we consider what interventions are necessary, that we may be underestimating the necessary interventions. Caregivers' ability to cope is also really important. Children take cues from the people around them. So here where staff are getting ill from the virus and are afraid themselves, understandably, of being at work or interacting with the children, that may affect the children's ability to cope in facilities. And finally, I just want to note that response to disaster really affects children's trajectories long-term. Trauma results in worse physical and mental health outcomes for children. And so it's really important that we think of this not just as a physical health crisis for our kids, but also as a mental health crisis for them. So one thing is, if we're being rehabilitative, what does rehabilitative custody look like in the context of this pandemic? And I would argue that we should really consider taking as many kids out of this traumatic scenario as we possibly can. As many other advocates have argued, the decreasing arrest rate and detention rate for kids maybe demonstrates that we didn't need to be detaining all of these kids in the first place. And that's one way in which this crisis reveals to us what has already been there below the surface the whole time. So I hope that in considering how we are setting ourselves up and our communities up for public safety and for being a source of positive child development, that we'll look forward to ways to reconsider, remake, and unmake this juvenile legal system during and after the pandemic. So that's all I have for you. I would be happy to answer any questions I can.
Madalyn, this is Joellen. What are some changes that you feel need to be made to the juvenile legal system?
Yeah, so one thing is that we know that even in the best of circumstances, that detaining kids in custody is more likely to make them, to result in them being rearrested. It's more likely that they will be involved in the adult criminal legal system. And so one of the things I think is that we need to severely curtail the amount of detaining of kids that we do. There's this perception that any action by a kid really should have sort of a similar response to that of a person if they were an adult. But because of what we know about aging out of kids in the criminal legal system, meaning that a lot of things that kids do, they're gonna stop doing just because they get older and their brain develops, and not because they needed some sort of reformation personally. Because we know that, I think it should really inform how we respond, and really how much we really need to respond at all, or whether sometimes we need to recognize that retribution is not productive for kids at this age.
Thank you.
I have a question, Madalyn. We're talking about a disease. So earlier you talked about, two different judges weren't entertaining release because there's no proof that COVID is as deadly for children or minors as it is for adults. But recent research is showing that there is a possibility of lasting brain damage. So in the future, one, because like you said, they're already dealing or going to have to deal with some of the effects of the mental and physical trauma they've dealt with. But do you think in the future that if this brain damage leads to, I guess, more impulsive decision-making, or decision-making that then makes them more susceptible to more incarceration or more exposure to the carceral system? So normally they wouldn't get in trouble except that they already got this background of incarceration. Do you think that that potential brain damage from COVID is going to mitigate their future, any future exposure in the carceral system, or you think it's going to exacerbate it? They're actually punished for having caught this disease in a juvenile facility, and it affected their ability to make smarter decisions because they now have brain damage.
Yeah,
Sounds like a lot. So.
So I think there are a few things to sort of unpack there. One is that I'm not sure exactly, so brain damage is a really broad term, and I don't know exactly what the brain damage effects they're finding are. To the extent that it results in sort of a cognitive disability, people with intellectual disabilities are not more likely to commit crime. And it's really important to remember that that is not sort of a thing that makes you more dangerous. And so in that sense, I don't think it is likely to result in them getting more tangled up in the criminal legal system. To the extent that they have already been involved in the criminal legal system, however, and that they've had their education disrupted, and that cognitive difficulty might make it more difficult for them to complete their education, that does serve as sort of a risk factor for future offending. Again, not that people who have less education are necessarily more likely to commit crimes, but the sort of when you bind all those things together, statistically that does become more likely. I also think that we should also care about that, right, for its own sake. Like, we should care that we don't know what's going to happen to these children, and that we don't know how this is going to affect their trajectory in the long term, and just their ability to provide for their families in the future, their ability to be a normal part of their community. We don't know that much, and we speak as if we do know a lot about what will happen, and it's just so hard to say. And then there's also the multi-systemic inflammatory syndrome that's happening, which causes children to sort of stroke out, for lack of a better term, and it comes on the heels of a COVID exposure. And it's a very low percentage of children, but you also cannot predict who it will happen to. And so I think it's true that on the whole, most children are not going to die of COVID if they catch it. We know that so far it appears that some children will, and we can't predict who those children will be. And we also know now, there's a new study out of South Korea that demonstrates that older children are actually more likely to pass on COVID than younger children or adults. So in the, I think, 10 to 18-year-old range. And so they are major transmitters of the disease. And I think we also should care about what happens to staff and their families in the facilities. And as you saw, staff numbers of infections are really high. And they're much more likely to be in the populations that are severely affected if they contract COVID as well.
So we're talking about cruel and unusual punishment for juveniles?
Yeah.
And in Louisiana, the juvenile system isn't allowed to be punitive. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, and then, so I believe you said this, that any incarceration that's punitive, like on its face, is a violation of cruel and unusual punishment. Is that what you said?
Yeah, so there's sort of a more intricate way of describing it, but effectively, yes. They have to be able to show that so incarceration always has to be reasonably related to the purpose of the incarceration. And when you say, because of the Louisiana system, that it can't be punitive, then you're at this point where you have to, it is cruel and unusual if it's punishment, because it's can't be for punishment, right?
Right. Yes, I got it. I just wanted to check that. So I did some research in Louisiana, and so I was trying to get that straight. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, along those same lines, courts that have looked at punishment for kids in Louisiana have previously said that the care needs to look as nearly as possible to that which would be provided by a parent. And so there's also sort of child welfare type restrictions involved in the sort of due process, cruel and unusual punishment standard that gets put sort of cobbled together when you make these claims about kids in custody.
Thank you for this entire presentation. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.